Hey quilters, it's Patti Carey of Patti's Patchwork. Thank you for joining me in the For the Brave Quilt-Along event celebrating the 10th anniversary of Northcott's Stonehenge Stars and Stripes collection. This month we're on to block 6 of this stunning Quilts of Valor sized quilt. It is the last month of the 6 unique blocks in this quilt. Here's what you need to get started.
No new pieces this time. We used the previously cut pieces of C5, D1, E4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, along with H1 and H3 and L2. We start by sewing a cream triangle E onto adjacent edges of 4 L2s. I'm going to align the top square corner, and the E triangle is going to extend 3/8 of an inch below the bottom edge. We've seen this several times throughout the quilt-along. I'll finger press the seam toward fabric L. Then I can add next triangle to the adjacent edge of L. Again, I align the top square corner of the E triangle with the square corner of L. And this time the patches cross on the 1/4 inch seam line. I finger press my seam toward L and make 4 of these units. Now I can add my H1 triangle onto this edge. I align the top triangle tips, and my H1 triangle will extend 3/8 of an inch below the bottom square edge of my L unit. I'll finger press my seam toward H1. Throughout this block, I do like to finger press because we do have some biased edges sometimes, and this is one of those times. I'm going to add my E4 triangle, and I like to start with the triangle end of these units. My machine feeds better when I have the square end of the unit at the bottom. I'll finger press my seam toward fabric H and make 4 of these. We'll move along to our 2 at a time half square triangles using E8 and H3. I'm going to make 2 sets of these. I've drawn a line with a hair marker, and I'm stitching a scant 1/4 inch down each side of that line. Then I will cut along the line and trim off my tips. Sometimes I do this by cutting a square as I'm cutting along my line. I'll finger press my seam toward fabric H. Then I'm building the other segment or unit for our sections. I'm going to start by sewing an E9 triangle onto 4 L2s and finger press toward fabric L away from the background. Now I can treat this unit as a 4 patch, so I'm going to sew the 2 pieces in the top row together and chain piece the 2 pieces in the bottom row next. I'm going to repeat this 3 more times. I'll finger press my seam toward fabric L on each of the 2 rows so that my seams will nest, and I sew the rows together. I like to start with the triangle end. I find it's easier to manage since the row that you see on top has 2 seams, and I can better manage the direction of those seams to make sure they don't get flipped around. I'll finger press my seam toward that top row. Now I can add my C5 triangle and my D1 triangle onto these units. So I start by adding my C triangle onto the 1 unit, aligning the top square ends and having the units cross on the 1/4 inch seam line. And then I'll add my D triangle to the other unit. And I'm going to align the top tips. This is a bias seam, so I want to handle it very carefully, easing the seam into my toward my needle as I'm sewing it. I find my machine likes it better when I start with the triangle end of this seam and finish with the square end of the seam. See what works best for you. I'll finger press the seam toward fabric D, and now I can sew these 2 segments together. and align the bottom tips. So I'll start with the square end at the top because this unit has more seams, so I can better manage those seams when I can see them on the top. And I keep the units aligned at the bottom triangle end. And again, I press my seam toward fabric D. I'm going to make 4 of these unusually shaped units. Once they're done, I can arrange them around my center E6 square. I'm going to sew a partial seam, and we did this in block 5. Sewing the first inch or so of my unit, my segment, onto my E6 square. And then I curve off the edge. I'll finger press this little seam toward my segment. Now I can add the next adjacent segment. I want to sew from the outer tip to the inner E center square. I align those triangle tips, and I'm going to nest the seams, match those seams at the first set of seams that you come to. Those are the only seams that will actually nest on this seam. I match the square ends at the center and keep my edges aligned. Just checking to make sure that my seams don't flip around inadvertently. And I'm going to finger press towards this unit that I have just added. Finger pressing. I can place it back in my arrangement, and I can continue clockwise, working around the block, adding each additional segment. Nesting that first seam and keeping the units aligned at the bottom square end of the seam. Once I've got all 4 units added, I can finish that partial seam that I started a few moments ago, again sewing from the outer edge to just past where I curved off. Aligning the tips, nesting that first seam, and then sewing along the seam line until I cross where I've sewn off previously. So I want to go just past where I curved off, and I'll curve off again. And it looks like that. Finger press the seam, and your lovely block 6 is done. Congratulations.
And here you have block 6. Isn't she a beauty? Now it's your turn. Once you've completed your block, please head on over to Northcott's Instagram page and enter the month 6 giveaway for your chance at some fabulous prizes. All of the details are on Northcott's Instagram page. If you haven't already done so, you are welcome to also join the For the Brave Quilt-Along newsletter group on pattispatchwork.com. You'll find all of the details under the Quilt-Alongs tab on my website. And there's also a For the Brave Quilt-Along Facebook group, and you're welcome to join there too. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you back here next month for the Applique 4-Patch block.